I want to thank you all for coming on this hot, hot day. I can't imagine where else you'd like to be. This is, of course, our condition. You can feel it. I know. I have to tell you about Dover. When I said this earlier, when I first got here, when we first thought we would open a restaurant, we looked at the roundhouse that's over here and we thought, that'd be a really wonderful restaurant. And then Gene said, yeah, but where do you park the cars? And we thought, that's a thought. One of the other wonderful things about Dover is chocolate donuts. Harvey had chocolate donuts. I came from New York. I had never tasted them, and I thought, whoa, this is way out there. So, and the trees in Dover are the most beautiful in the whole state. I got to tell you, I'd like to take some of these trees back to South Berwick, but you can't. So, all right, I'm going to begin to read a couple of things for you. I hope you enjoy them. You better. This is called The Arrival. In the 60s, if you flew between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., you could buy a round-trip ticket from LaGuardia Airport to Logan for $22. I would leave my Manhattan apartment on East 90th Street at 10 a.m., catch the 11 o'clock flight out of LaGuardia, and by noontime, the plane would be touching down in Boston, where by arrangement, my old friend and future business partner, Gene Brown, would be waiting for me. Gene had left New York a year before to take a job in New Hampshire as director of TRI, Theater Resources for Youth, one of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives administered through the University of New Hampshire. He had rented a picturesque little house in the town of Dover, New Hampshire, that had been modeled after an 18th century carriage house in Williamsburg, Virginia. Its dimensions were 20 by 20 by 20. It had a huge stone fireplace, and what had once been a hayloft became the bedroom. The builder, Allen Huggins, called it Tiny House. Tiny House sat at the edge of a field where the Bellamy River entered a little bay, surrounded by a mixed forest of white pines and hardwood. It was a pleasure to be there for the sounds alone, the wind moving through the surrounding woods or the bird song in the morning, unmuffled by the ceaseless clamor of urban traffic. It was on my first visit that Gene took me into Portsmouth. We arrived just after dark and parked in Market Square, the hub of this little seaport town, next to the imposing brick structure of the North Church. Its high, dramatically illuminated white steeple seemed to announce, I am Portsmouth. Parked alongside the church was Gillies, a red and yellow painted diner wagon, with a line of people waiting on the sidewalk and several cars lined up to order at the takeout window. A young man was standing on the hood of his car so that he could look directly in the window to order. Gilly, a wiry, short guy in his 60s, wore a white t-shirt and checkered chef's pants with a white apron and a round paper hat. Every evening, Gilly would haul the wagon into Market Square from a garage in Rye and pay the ritual daily fine incurred of $1 a night for parking illegally. The ultimate multitasker, Gilly was wonderful to watch, deftly managing the orders coming at him from both sides while carrying on a conversation with the cop who had stopped in for a coffee. What do you have, Bill? Gilly asked, addressing the young man on the hood of his car, whose name may or may not have been Bill. Gilly called everybody Bill, except the women and girls who were called Miss. While the menu was limited, the food was good and inexpensive. You could get a plate of beans or a hamburger, but it was for his hot dogs that Gilly was really famous. I got mine with the works, embellished with green relish, yellow mustard, and chopped white onions. Here you go, Bill, Gilly said, handing me my order wrapped in wax paper, already grabbing a hot dog for the next order. Gene and I sat down on the church steps to eat. I imagined Sister Mary Catherine Aloysius, my second grade nun, tisking her disapproval of our eating hot dogs on church steps, even a Protestant one. She would have called it a venial sin. Sharing that meal together with Gene that first evening in Market Square, I felt an immediate affection and interest in this curious little town. Gillies, the North Church with its steeple piercing the quiet sky, the peacefulness of the town itself, it all got me wondering, could I live here? Okay. This is called Ceres Street. This is where we began. Oh, look, it's Captain Marvel, Gene said. I stopped at the end of Ceres Street, where it meets Bow Street, to consider Jean's superhero sighting. A dark-haired, square-jawed gentleman at work on one of the vacated warehouses halfway down Ceres Street, across from the tugboat dock. The three of us, Mark, John, Burke, Jean, and I, had recently become simultaneously unemployed and had decided to open a restaurant as a solution to our financial difficulties. Considering that we were all broke, it's hard for me to account, looking back now, why our complete lack of funding didn't seem a crushing discouragement at the time. But we were fired by an inexplicable optimism. The two realtors who we had consulted had shown us setups completely outfitted with steam tables, plates, and seating for 100 or more. Even if we could have afforded them, these behemoths were an impossible fit to the restaurant we envisioned. What we were looking for was a dining room. Not a restaurant. I wanted to cook dinner twice a night for about 30 people in 2 seatings. Oh, it'll never work, the realtors assured us when we informed them of this plan. People want to come and go as they please, not when the restaurant tells them. Diners want a huge selection on the menu. In view of these discouragements, we had decided to dispense with the realtors. If nothing else, it offered a pretext for Jean to introduce himself to the handsome Captain Marvel. We turned onto Ceres Street. In contrast to the realtors, Captain Marvel, who turned out to be Walter Jackson, a local businessman and owner of the building, was intrigued. He invited us in to see the space. It was exactly what we were looking for. The long, dark room had brick walls, a fireplace, and the ceilings were ribbed with heavy beams, all looking out over Ceres Street and the tugboats to the river with Kittery on the opposite shore. You know what? It sounds like a great idea, he said, handing Jean his card. Call me tomorrow. Let me think about it. Maybe we can work something out. The next afternoon, as arranged, I dialed the number that Walter had given us, my heart pounding with excitement. In Manhattan, property like this could run into the thousands. How could we ever afford it? But we discussed terms, and he agreed to lease us a space for a rent of 5% of our gross. You know how brilliant that is? That means if I had a bad week, we didn't have to close. Okay. But we discussed terms, and he agreed to the lease to lease us a space for a rent of 5% of our gross. Thrilled, we readily accepted his generous terms. The next morning, we arrived to find Walter putting up a covering of wallboard over the stone and brick of the ancient foundation. In New York City, exposed brick was a premium, and it was a big part of what had attracted us to this place. We thanked him, but insisted he just take it down. We had estimated $4,500 for opening costs. This was 1970, after all. $1,500 apiece. Jean took a loan from his brothers-in-law, while Mark and I were able to borrow our $3,000 from 2 friends, Bert Trafton and Mervyn Bronson, both teachers at Berwick Academy, with whom we had become acquainted after leaving New York. A native of South Berwick, Bert Trafton was a historian of Piscataqua architecture and had restored several of its fine old homes. He had unerring taste, and we agreed to his suggestions. Excuse me. Painting the plaster white with Wedgwood blue for the trim and installing a dark red carpet. The brick and stone were left as they were. Through a friend, we had been introduced to an art dealer in Henniker, New Hampshire, from whom we acquired several Hudson Valley landscapes. From this same dealer, we acquired a pair of calliope figures, the work of an Italian woodcarver. A little over 3 feet high, with remnants of their original blue, white, and gold colors, these 2 cherubic-looking boys had been constructed to play musical instrument, one a cymbal and the other a drum, animated by the movement of the calliope. The boys were a perfect fit for the deep sill of the large multi-paned window, which Walter had added in his renovations. They were a beautiful sight, foregrounding the scene beyond of tugboats and the river. Bert knew that the Governor Langdon Mansion was acquiring a new sign, and he suggested we use the old one for the restaurant. The Society for the Preservation of Antiquities was happy enough to have us take it. Our friend George Stavrinos, a talented artist, painted a huge strawberry in a pale blue over a white background. Most of what we spent to open the restaurant went to Wally Beaver's, a secondhand furniture and junk store in one of the last buildings on Market Street overlooking the salt piles. We bought 40 pressed wood dining room chairs for $2 apiece, 120 unmatched plates, 2 refrigerators, and 2 apartment-sized stoves. From a friend who was a salesman for Wedgwood, we acquired a sample case of 40 unmatched dinner plates and purchased a mixed collection of flatware from jewelry store closeouts. Nothing in our dining room matched, not the chairs, not the plates, or the flatware. Nothing except the crisp white tablecloths and napkins to unify this eclectic mismatch. On November the 18th, 1970, 17 days after we came upon that unfinished space, and with $1,800 left over from the original estimate of $4,500, thanks to Captain Marvel, we opened Blue Strawberry to a full house of 40 people. Shazam. Thank you. Oh, you're very nice. Thank you. Thank you. I want to read this. It's called Becoming a Chef. You know, I never studied cooking, and I just, everything was intuitive. Every time I walked in the kitchen, it was just intuition. Years later, I began to understand that intuition is the universe telling us thank you for what we've asked for. Okay, Becoming a Chef. It was January 1971. We had been open for less than 2 months. A raging nor'easter was blowing and the cancellations for dinner had been coming in all afternoon. I had just started to put away the food when there was a knock on the door, a party of 6. We saw candles in your window, they said. Are you still open? We're starved. Driven off the interstate by the severity of the storm, they had taken rooms out at the traffic circle as the Come As You Are motel, where the concierge had told them about our restaurant. The Come As You Are motel, that's how they built it. Jean invited them in, of course, and we seated them. Since they were the only party that evening, after dinner they invited us to join them over dessert and coffee. The food, they told us, had surpassed their expectations. They couldn't have been more appreciative. As it turned out, they were from Boston Magazine and had driven up to Kennebunkport to review an inn. They suggested the idea of doing a story on our restaurant. Of course, we were interested, and before they left that evening, the photographer retrieved his cameras from the car for a few shots of the dining room. They must have then sent an unidentified reviewer to dine because sometime later, a copy of Boston Magazine arrived in the mail. We were the cover story under the headline, "If you want a great dinner in Boston, try driving to Portsmouth, New Hampshire." You know, I got to tell you, that really kicked it off. It was just, you know. The review inaugurated our success. Immediately, we began getting reservations that brought people from Providence, Boston, and even New York City. Within months, we were reviewed in Newsweek International, along with top newspapers in the country with 5-star reviews that announced to the culinary audience, Blue Strawberry is American cuisine. I had never thought of my cooking as American. It was just cooking to me. Having been born in 1936 at the nadir of the Great Depression, I had grown up in a time of rationing and shortages. This state of affairs continued into the 50s. Fortunately, hamburger and chicken were always inexpensive. There were families in my neighborhood where the husband ate the finer cuts of meat on the assumption that as the breadwinner, he had priority, while the wife and children ate ground beef. Midwest. I was fortunate to have inherited knowledge of good cooking from both sides of my family. In Indiana, the McDonald's, my stepfather's family, were gifted cooks who brought the kitchen to new heights with generous, simple, elegant fare. In Port Washington, Wisconsin, my mother's people, the Kostekis and Dominicheks, served pork roast with sauerkraut or beef roast with deep, rich gravies, and cakes and pies that made me think about Poland and wonder if I still had family living there. My great aunts and uncles from Milwaukee fed me homemade kielbasa sandwiches on Polish rye bread slathered with butter. In Indiana, Grandma Hazel served fried chicken with milk gravy for hills of mashed potatoes, always saving me the drumsticks. And the Argentinian chef who cooked at Pablo's on East 48th Street, New York, where I once waited tables, served a cream of watercress soup whose beautiful pale green color astounded me with a taste which even now in my memory evokes a vivid recollection. And the night I first ate his paella, I knew I could never touch minute rice again. Suyu, the Indonesian chef at Chumley's in Greenwich Village, where I had worked after Pablo's, served a dish called Indonesian rice, hunks of tenderloin of beef on a veggied rice, served covered in a peanut butter sauce with a fried egg on top. This was 1967. Even in New York, this was a combination so unexpected, it was practically surreal. Peanut butter on meat with a fried egg on top? But I love the novelty of this mixture of peanut butter with cream and Asian spices. One evening, friends and I found a place on the Upper East Side called Casa Brazil, a small Brazilian restaurant that served a dinner twice a night, one at 7 o'clock and a second at 9. The food was served in courses to everyone at the same time. First a soup, then an appetizer, followed by a choice of duck or veal, 4 sides, a salad, and a dessert. That evening at Casa Brazil planted the seeds that cultivated my future. For me, Casa Brazil was one of the greatest dining experiences I had ever known, and it seemed like a perfect way to run a restaurant. You'd simply cook dinner for 40 people twice a night. Yeah, well, it wasn't funny the first night. And I had my friend George Severinos, our friend George Severinos, who painted the blue strawberry sign, was a Greek kid who grew up in his father's diner. And so opening night, I had Albert in there in the kitchen with me. He was the only one, and I was cooking, and Albert was trying to do everything else. Albert was 17 years old, from Dover. He was one of 16 children, French Catholics who lived on Rabbit Road. Figure it out. Anyway, he came into the kitchen. He says, here's what you got to do. Set this pan up, keep all your silver in it while you're waiting to wash it. Do this over here, keep this clear for you making salad. He was like really wonderful. And so we kept it like that for the entire time that we owned the restaurant, 25 years. This is called Bow Street Antiques and the Modern Laundrette. The sign almost remains, black script painted across a whitewashed brick wall. More than just a sign, it's a bridge between the present and what must have been, excuse me, my first sight of Bow Street on a summer afternoon sometime in the late 60s. A restaurant has since opened in that space under the same name, but back then, Ruth Barnett ran Bow Street Antiques there. An old Yankee, Ruth was always nicely turned out in a tailored suit with a small on-the-face hat and an expression that was almost a smile. I loved browsing through her stock of collectibles. Old glass and bottles from the 1800s, brass candlesticks, Bennington pottery, and lots of flow blue china, which I had begun collecting at that time. Her stock turned over quickly because her prices were reasonable. I was a regular customer. I found her frequently there in the company of her old friend Bobby, who would be in the store helping out. I once asked if they were married. Oh, no, she replied with alacrity. No, just a friend. Never been married, never cared to. Their friendship, whatever it was, had many characteristics of a good marriage. Whenever I saw the two of them together, they'd be chatting away happily. They never seemed at a loss for topics. An actor in need of lessons for a classic New England accent couldn't have done better than spend an afternoon shopping at the bowsprit for the sake of overhearing their conversation. Bobby had a way of sucking his breath in the affirmatives. Yes, spec so, as a kind of extra emphasis on an accent or a peculiarity I've known in other old friends from rural Maine. You know, I can't say it. You know what I mean when they say, yes, I spec so, and they suck a breath in? Cannot do it. I'm still in the Midwest. Raised in Waterville, Maine, Bobby had attended a year of college, but left to work at the Navy Yard in Kittery, which he quit soon after, explaining that it was too hot and awful confusing. A tiny man in his late 60s, just under 5 feet tall with thick glasses, he had the appearance of a wizened 10-year-old. He wore an odd array of surprising but tasteful clothes that had a decidedly feminine effect. Shoes embroidered over the instep with floral motifs, or sometimes embellished with tassels and a slight heel. dress shirts silky enough to seem blouse-like, all topped off with a blue plaid tam. He accounted for this unconventional attire by explaining that, given his small size and lack of resources, the only place he could ever find anything he could afford and to fit him was in the women's section of the basement church sales at which he shopped. I assumed he was on assistance. People would leave him food, a sandwich or some cans of soda would often appear at his doorstep with a candy bar or two. He was a patron of the harbor cafeteria, and I would see him there eating a little macaroni and cheese or chili with some soda crackers while conversing with the cook, with whom he was also quite friendly. Bobby lived sparingly in 2 rooms on Ceres Street, on the ground floor beneath the fabled balcony where our friends Barbara and Hodge had lived. The door of his apartment faced across Ceres Street to the tugboat yard where Harbor Master Holt prevented him to plant a garden in the patch of dirt that ran along the fence. He grew a mix of annual flowers centered on an Art Deco Hummel of the Virgin Mary, a gift from Ruth Barnett. One summer, Tom and Al, a couple of young scallywags, who were renting an apartment on Ceres Street while working construction in Seabrook, transplanted a couple of marijuana seedlings into Bobby's flower bed. They grew unnoticed amid the petunias and marigolds until sometime during the end of summer, when a sudden surge in their growth brought them to Bobby's attention. He called me across Ceres Street one afternoon to look at them. They were about 5 feet tall, sporting dense flower heads filled with seeds. Well, I asked Al what kind of plant it was, he said, and Al told me it's called a puff plant. You ever hear of anything like that, a puff plant? And then one morning, not long afterward, Bobby woke to find that the puff plants had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Once a week, I would see him laboring up Ceres Street with a plastic bag of his laundry to the one laundromat within walking distance, the ironically named Modern Laundrette, just off State Street behind Richardson's Market. You had to step down to enter and remember to bring plenty of quarters, as the change machine hadn't worked for years. All the machines were a bit of a gamble, and you had to be careful which one you chose. A percentage were sure to be out of order, and you needed to be mindful not to slip in the stagnant water that pooled in the depressions of the concrete floor. This garishly lit fishbowl of a space looked out through a plate glass window from the first floor of an otherwise windowless building that rose 3 stories to a flat roof enclosed by fencing and protected by a German shepherd that barked continuously. Robert Dunn, one of the city's early poet laureates, and also a patron of this dubious establishment, once dubbed it Beirut East. Bobby told me that if you didn't sit there and keep your eye on your dryers, somebody would steal your clothes. Oh, yes, sirree, he said, with the aforementioned intake of breath. I make sure I go to the bathroom before I leave the house, because if you have to go up to use Richardson, by the time you get back, your clothes will be gone. Imagine, he said in disbelief, stealing somebody's underwear. Dear. I have, how are we doing? Well, we're kind of okay. This is called Clarence Chowder House. And this is about the woman who owned it. Walter Jackson's, can you hear me okay on the thing? Can you all hear me? Yes. Oh, that's, je suis très amazed, I'm amazed, okay. That's all the French I know, except pâté. You know, I wrote this book, Vie de France, and after it had been out, this is just a quick story that's away from this. I got a phone call from a guy and he said, hi, my name is Bob Arbite. My wife and I just read your book, Vie de France. You really get it. Well, we own a house in France. We want you to come and use it. I said, really? I said, do I have to cook? He said, well, only if you want to. I said, do you want me to write about it? He said, no, we want you to come and to enjoy the house. The house is really nice. So it's not quite in the south of France. It's at the Dordogne. Is that correct? I got to tell you, what a wonderful, wonderful time. And so we didn't go quite then. We couldn't afford it, and things were kind of tough. And so we said, why don't you come and visit us? Come and stay a couple of days. They said, well, we'll bring our bicycles. It'll be a great place where we can ride our bikes. We said, that's fine. They arrived in the middle of a storm that was a storm, and of course we had no walk to our house, just a muddy path, saving money. And he was carrying a big box, and she was carrying this wonderful bag. They brought it into the house. The box turned out to be a case of wine, and the box was 3 pounds of homemade pate. I got to tell you, we've known these people ever since. Why not? They really are wonderful. I get photographs of her, what she's eating. And here we are in France, and we're eating this. Here's where we are. We ate this. You know, really kind of wonderful people. Anyway, I'm off of it. This is called Clarence's Chowder House. Walter Jackson's father ran a chandlery in our building at the Market Street address above us. And after he died, Clarence, an employee of 30 years, continued to manage the business for Walter. Clarence was an irascible old bird, but we were fond of him and shocked to hear that he had died dramatically one morning of a heart attack as he was turning the key in the door to open for the day. What was that? Are we okay? Okay. After Clarence's death, Walter opted to annex the chandlery into his hardware business in Kittery, and the Market Street shop was closed. The space had sat vacant for a while when we had the idea of opening a chowder house. Walter drew up another of his characteristically generous leases, and we planned for a lunch menu with lots of soups, bread and cheese, wonderful sandwiches, and simple desserts. And in Clarence's honor, we called it Clarence's Chowder House. I called his wife to inform her of this tribute, offering her free chowder for life. Oh, bullshit, she replied. That old son of a bitch is finally gone. I don't want nothing in his name. Initially, I had intended to cook for both restaurants, but after a few weeks, I realized it was more than I could handle. And for that reason, we decided to sell the Chowder House. And the business was purchased by Chick and Linda, a nice young couple with 2 active little boys. Margaret had become friendly with Linda, and she and their friends would spend long afternoons by the wood stove at Linda's house, an old Victorian on a back road out in Farmington, brewing exotic teas and discussing Buddhism, women's rights, or the journals of Anais Nin. No, you're not supposed to laugh. I was told once, you know, that's not a funny line. Oh, okay, I had no idea. I didn't read her. During one of these confabs, the 2 little boys somehow succeeded in igniting a small fire in one of the bedrooms, and the fire department was called. After the conflagration was extended, the fire chief took the occasion to suggest to Linda that she needed to keep a better eye on the kids. Not long after this, the couple separated. In the course of these domestic upheavals, they decided to sell Clarence's. It was then purchased by Mary Jane Moulton, a woman I had not yet met. And therein lies the tale. The first time I saw Mary Jane, she was dressed in jodhpurs with knee-length boots, an Eisenhower-style hunting jacket, and an Indiana Jones hat. After she purchased the business, she changed the name from the masculine Clarence's to the pro-feminine Clarence's, choosing Botticelli's Venus on the half shell for her logo. She had rustic cabinets and hutches built for the dining room, and installed swinging doors for the kitchen with 2 bright panels made by Susan Pratt of stained glass orange carrots, a proxy for the Gemini twins of Mary Jane's birth sign. The food was served on hand-thrown dinnerware which she had traveled to a women's crafts consortium in the Carolinas to acquire. Vases of fresh-cut flowers adorned each table, and there was an air of country respite. You could sit and have a tea or a bowl of soup and read your favorite book while watching the river traffic. On Sunday afternoons, Clarence's hosted a coffee house for local musicians and vocalists to perform, and on one of these occasions, Mary Jane arranged for Eleanor Smeal, a co-founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation and twice president of the National Organization for Women to Speak. That's a lot to talk about. We served an afternoon dinner on Sundays. From my kitchen, I could hear Miss Smeal's address down the common staircase, which our 2 floors shared, but only as a stream of indistinguishable words punctuated by vigorous applause. I couldn't resist taking the opportunity of a brief pause to shout up the stairwell the unfortunate logo of the Silent Woman restaurant in Waterville, Maine, where I had recently eaten. There is nothing more brilliant than a silent woman. The rejoinder came swiftly back. Fuck you. A follower of the radical theologian Mary Daly, author of Beyond God the Father, Mary Jane had replaced the patriarch with a matriarch. This was a bedrock principle of her theology. She incorporated anything that embraced feminine destiny, pursuing her studies in esoteric religious tradition. Despite our initial run-ins, Mary Jane and I somehow became good friends. I loved Clarence's. The food was great. Mary Jane's chowder was award-winning, but her chocolate pudding cake knocked me for a loop. After she had died, I was remembering this cake with Anne Sauvé. I told her how Mary Jane had kept the recipe a secret from me. Secret recipe, Anne said. She took it from Betty Crocker. If I popped upstairs at lunchtime asking for patty food, Mary Jane would shake her head and smile, putting a spoonful of meatloaf in the palm of my outstretched hands. On days when all of my side work was done, I would go upstairs for a late afternoon visit after she had closed for the day. Sometimes we would play Willie Nelson or Waylon Jennings records, and we danced together. Her blonde hair piled rakishly, tendrils slipping free in artful disarray. We called it the Waltz of the Chefs. I recall one memorable afternoon, the two of us, watching the astounding sight of the 18th century Joshua Wentworth house, chimneys and all, heading down the river on a barge to its new location overlooking Pierce Island. Previous to purchasing Clarence's, Mary Jane had taught school in Laconia for 15 years. She had been married and had 3 sons. This bare-bones sketch of her history was as much as I ever knew about her life before she came to Portsmouth. Is everyone okay? What happened now? So I'm becoming my mother. Well, it always happens. You know, you guys, think about it. It was clear from her reactions that she wished to avoid interrogation of her life in Laconia, and I accommodated this reticence as a condition of our friendship. In time, her boys, now in their adolescence, began spending time with their mother in Portsmouth. I even hired the 2 eldest, Rocky and Duke, for my kitchen, but their employment was short-lived. After I came in one morning to find the kitchen unswept and dishes in the sink, I fired them. Marguerite, who had been setting up the dining room, popped into the kitchen after they left and said, "Boy, I don't want to be here when Mary Jane finds out you fired her kids." Just as she spoke, as if on cue, there was a sound of Mary Jane stomping down the steps to my kitchen. Marguerite took the opportunity to make herself scarce, but I stood my ground, and after we had spoken, she conceded to my objections. The 5% of our gross that Walter had been charging us had been an immense boost in our early days, but by 1979, we were thriving. At $18 a head as compared to the $8 we had originally charged, Walter felt that the 5% had become excessive. He suggested that we buy the building, which we did, for $95,000. Yeah, within 3 years, real estate in Portsmouth skyrocketed, and the town assessed our building at $1.3 million. With the taxes now calculated on a $1 million asset, we realized we would have to raise the rent on the upper floors. But we explained to Mary Jane that the $200 a month we charged her didn't even pay the taxes on Clarence's floor, let alone make us a profit. But Mary Jane was adamant. "Oh no," she insisted. "According to the lease, I paid $200, period." Since Clarence's was only open 2 hours a day and barely made enough money to pay the rent, I suggested to her that she should stay open a few more hours. Her food was really quite good, and people would fill the place up, but she tersely suggested that I should mind my own business. And in view of our friendship, I complied with her request. I felt torn between my regard for her and my 2 partners, but Jean and Mark insisted on contacting our lawyer. According to the attorney, though, Mary Jane was right. When we had sold Clarence's to Chick and Linda, we had neglected to revise our lease with Walter, which Mary Jane had inherited in the sale. Smart business guys? Well, okay. This state of affairs continued for several months, which further antagonized Mark and Jean, but Mary Jane and I were able to overlook the conflict, and we remained friends by agreeing to avoid the topic. And then one morning there was a fire in the apartment above Clarence's. Fortunately, the damage was limited, mostly smoke and water, but there was a clause in the lease that said, in the event of a fire, it had to be renegotiated. I urged my partners to let the insurance pay for it all and allow Mary Jane to continue under the original terms of the lease. But Jean and Mark were adamant. They insisted that we should take the opportunity to settle with Mary Jane, pay her off, and get her out, which we did, for $16,000. With that, she closed up Clarence's and left. She continued giving astrological and tarot readings for the small clientele she began cultivating while still running Clarence's, supplementing her income with odd jobs cleaning houses. For some time, she lived with Anne Sauvé, but in her 60s, things got a little rocky for her, and she occasionally lived out of her car. But after she turned 65, she became eligible for a subsidized apartment in North Berwick in an old Italian Victorian with an offset tower that had once been featured in a Stephen King movie. Y'all know this house? When I first saw this impressive house, it hadn't been painted for 100 years. I knew there must be people living there because of the cars parked outside, but the two upper floors appeared vacated with tattered curtains blowing out through the open and broken windows, just as they would be in a Stephen King story. With the money that was earned from the movie, the town had been able to buy and renovate the old place. The house was nicely painted a pale rose with the trim and decorative details accentuated in a complementary color, and it was opened up for senior citizens. Mary Jane's apartment was on the second floor and comprised two spacious rooms in which the original woodwork had been preserved, with pleasant views of the surrounding country through the large windows. She would often have us over for dinner, characteristically simple fare, but delicious. I always anticipated a dinner at Mary Jane's with pleasure. After she acquired the apartment, her financial insecurities were alleviated. I think of this as a golden period for her. She had become a grandmother, and her relations with the three boys seemed affectionate. Once a month, we would join her at her favorite restaurant in downtown North Berwick for breakfast with our fellow Berwickians. In her comings and goings between North Berwick and Portsmouth, she would often stop in for a visit. And it was on one of these occasions, as we were sharing an iced tea together up on the hill behind the house, that she told me the unsettling news she had just received. It was a diagnosis of cancer. In the year preceding this news, she had been treated for a heart ailment with surgery, but her recovery had been fitful, and there was some discussion of a second surgery. But after this new diagnosis, the surgeons advised the postponement of the second surgery. She began chemo, but sometime later, she confessed to me that she had stopped. It was too unsettling, she explained. It made her ill. What she was saying was that she had had enough of whatever had been. I just don't want to do this anymore, she told me. And I wondered if she was talking about the long, unhappy, tilting time of illness or about her life. In the final months of her illness, she was moved to a nursing home in Portsmouth, where she lived out the rest of her days. After she died, I arranged for a small memorial service in her honor, held at a well-appointed function room at the Women's City Club. Even Portsmouth chefs who had not known Mary Jane sent platters of food for this commemoration of her life. Given the feminist sympathies of Clarence's, it was unsurprisingly mostly women who had worked there rose to testify to her mentoring influences in their lives. Her three sons, Rocky, Duke, and Casey, were in attendance, and I couldn't help wonder if these testimonies, which were from a time when they had been separated from their mother, weren't overshadowed for them by the memory of her leaving. I loved Mary Jane. I loved her mind, her idiosyncrasies, her belief in the tarot, the mysticism of a matriarch. I did not want to accept her leaving. One night after she and I had known each other for years, we were having dinner together and were remembering our first impressions of one another. When I had told her that I first assumed that she was a lesbian, she was dismissive and countered, "Oh, Jimmy, there's so much you don't know about women." I had to confess she was right. Okay, I think we have a little, does anybody want more?
Oh. The other day you thought about sharing that story of opening blue strawberry and not having oil for the salad dressing.
Yeah, I was, it's like today, you forget your glasses, you forget a pen, you forget this, you forget that. I go to cook, I forget food. And so it was opening night, and I had everything in the kitchen that I thought. And it suddenly occurred to me, I don't have any olive oil. I don't have any oil at all in the kitchen. The fuck am I going to do for a salad dressing? I said, okay, what do I do now? And I got to tell you, and immediately it came into my bread. Well, here's what you do. Put some cranberries into the blender, put some maple syrup, put some Dijon mustard into it, and then fill it up with ice and grind it up. And so I did this, and what I got was this frosty salad dressing. People said, "Oh, this is amazing. I've never eaten this before." And I thought, Jesus Christ. So, it's the whole time that I cooked, it was just, I just loved doing it. And I just never knew what I was going to do till I got to the restaurant. And I thought, well, what have I got to eat? Or I'd go shopping, or somebody would drop in with something. They say that I was the first farm to table. That's not true. My farm to table was Market Basket and our restaurant. There wasn't a lot of farm to table in those days, 1969, 1970. And so, and then one day a woman, Connie Weeks, walked in and she said, "I have fresh herbs and flowers. Are you interested?" I have to tell you, I had never had fresh herbs in my life. I hadn't been to Europe yet. And I had only tasted dried herbs. I think it was about 1947. We were eating pizza for the first time. It's the first time I had dried oregano and basil. I had never tasted that before. This is the Midwest. If you got a little garlic, you were considered, oh, it's too far out. So anyway, we have a little time. And so I'd like to read you something from a book called Salt and Pepper Cooking, The Education of an American Chef. And it's called Chocolate, okay? How can you miss? When I was 3 years old, I was placed for a time in a state-supported foster home, owing to family and financial difficulties. The foster home was an old farmhouse in Downers Grove, Illinois, owned by Mr. and Mrs. Winter. Meal times were communal and visits were treated as social occasions for the entire household. I vividly remember being visited there by my mother. On this day, she had brought me a nickel-sized Hershey bar, a sumptuous extravagance in those waning days of the Great Depression. We sat in the front parlor with Mr. and Mrs. Winter and the other 5 foster children then boarding there. "Now, buddy," Mrs. Winter admonished, "don't you think it would be nice if all the children had a taste? You don't want to be known as selfish, do you?" My heart fell. But obediently, I unwrapped the Hershey bar and broke it into several small pieces. Using the top of a Tinker Toy can as a tray, I suddenly passed from child to child as Mrs. Winter had instructed me, until only the very smallest piece was left for myself. I held the velvety taste of that morsel in my mouth until it dissolved and finally was gone. This fragment of sweetness that my mother had given to me, I hadn't wanted to share or even eat. I had wanted to keep it for myself, like a part of her that wouldn't be leaving on the next train. If, as psychology has taught us, we go through life seeking compensation for what was lost to us in our childhoods, then my lifelong passion for chocolate must be rooted in this early experience. The Hershey bar that I had been forced to share at Downers Grove, and my own small portion that had melted away, leaving an unfulfilled desire for more, like the anguish that assailed me at the thought of my mother's imparting departure on a train that I was unable to stop. Chocolate had become for me the symbol of love and self-worth, and like the chocolate, I never seemed to get enough of either. Thank you. Thank you, that's really nice. I'd like to, you all know what pierogi is? You all know what pierogi is. This is called pierogi. It's a very important day in my life, this pierogi. My mother's brother Arnold and his wife Pauline lived across the town from us in a subdivision west of Mannheim Road, not far from the hubcap factory where Uncle Arnold worked the second shift. I was 15 years old when my Aunt Pauline asked me to babysit my three cousins, Janice, Johnny, and Diane, one night while she went out to a baby shower. I fell asleep on the couch and at daybreak was awakened by the sound of a raucous argument between my aunt and uncle. Suddenly, Arnold charged into the living room and belligerently ordered me out of his house. Although I had done nothing wrong, I feared that there would be further trouble from this incident and that I was certain somehow to get the blame. Reluctant to face any inquiry from my mother, I avoided going home. Instead, I took a streetcar to the old neighborhood where Uncle Joey, my mother's eldest brother, and his wife Stella lived in a fourth-floor walk-up on Haddon Street with their two daughters, my cousins Judy and Joyce. I trusted that Stella, with whom I had always felt a rapport, despite my mother's unflattering opinions of her, would understand that I was the injured party. Aunt Stella hennaed her beautiful hair a Titian red and wore India ink Marlene Dietrich eyebrows that gave her an expression of continual, compassionate surprise. She kept their little apartment spotless. You couldn't flick a cigarette without her immediately emptying the ashtray and wiping it clean with a damp cloth. She attended Mass every morning and sent my immaculately dressed cousins to Precious Blood, a Polish Catholic school in the neighborhood. What a name. When I arrived that morning, Stella insisted on frying me a bacon sandwich. As I related the story of Arnold's ravings, she shook her head in disbelief. Now, as she set about making some pierogies, we discussed the episode at Aunt Paula and Uncle Arnold's with all of its possible reverberations. And what about Paula, she asked, throwing a handful of flour across the table and rolling out the ball of dough flat and thin. I told her that I heard Paula threatening Arnold that she was going back to Texas and taking the kids. Oh, Jesus, my aunt sighed, shaking her head. My God, those poor children. Arnold is crazy, always crazy. I knew that he was crazy when he stood up for your Uncle Joe at our wedding. Mixing farmer's cheese into mashed potatoes, she went on explaining. He didn't think it was right that your mother should be a bridesmaid because she was already showing. Joey and Floyd were mad too, but nothing like Arnold. Can't women be bridesmaids when they're going to have babies, I asked. Oh, sure, she replied, but your mother wasn't married. I put the bacon sandwich down. She wasn't, I asked. Well, nobody. That's why Arnold was having such a fit. Cutting circles out of the dough with a water glass, she began to place a spoonful of the potato cheese mixture into each of the rounds, fold them over, and seal the edges with a wet fork. You mean she wasn't married to my father when she had me? I asked. Looking up from her work, she answered uneasily, well, Jimmy's not your real father, but you knew that, didn't you? I hadn't known. Stella's indiscretion had broken the tacit silence that prevailed in the family regarding my illegitimate birth. Under cover of this open secret, Millie had allowed the supposition to be made that I was Jimmy's offspring. As I took it all in, I suddenly understood why I was told my birth certificate had been lost. I remembered Millie posing for a photo up in Port Washington, Wisconsin, wearing Cousin Evelyn's wedding dress. She and Jimmy had eloped, she explained, and never had a church wedding or pictures taken in a white dress. Sadly, when the photo was developed, a large hen could be seen walking across the lawn close behind her. I think I actually have that picture. No, maybe not. Do you know who my real father? At that time, unwed motherhood was still considered a great disgrace. It marked the child as offspring of licentiousness. Do you know who my real father was? I asked, hopefully. Stella told me she had never met him, and having revealed too much already, she was anxious to avoid any further inquiries concerning my parentage. Take some pierogi home to your mother, she suggested, busying herself with wrapping several of the pierogi in wax paper, which she put into a brown paper bag left over from the AMP. I felt it was time for me to go. On the Milwaukee Avenue streetcar home, I thought of what Stella had told me. I considered the mystery of my real father's identity. Where did he live? Did I look like him? Would we like each other? Would he be rich and buy me a car? And it suddenly occurred to me that all those people that I had known and loved in Indiana were not really my family anymore. Transferring onto the Belmont Avenue bus, I thought about Jimmy and Millie and my brother Jerry as though they were the family and I was an outsider. I felt detached. Stella's revelation had permanently altered my relations with my mother, and not long afterward, I was 15 years old. I'd left for school one morning and never returned. So I think that maybe this should be, the end. I have some books, if you'd like. I'm happy to sell them. I'm delighted to sell them. Thank you all. Thank you all. So I'm going to move over to this side, I think, and move this chair. Oh, okay. And I'll sit over here. And you brought a pen.
I brought a pen and I have another one.
You know, it's a good thing people are sensible in my life. You know, I have to thank you all for coming. It's such a hot night and so unpleasant, and yet you all came out. That's really nice, and I recognize faces here. I recognize them. Where's my barber? Okay, that's my barber sitting there. She's got her hand up. She does a wonderful haircut. I need to go tomorrow. Yes, question.
Well, when you opened the strawberry and decorated it was in the late 60s, early 70s.
It was 1970.
And I remember 1970, and I'm just curious why you decided to have a white tablecloth, white napkins, rather than gypsy cloths.
I wanted it to be wonderful. I wanted it to be upscale. I wanted it to be elegant. And I knew that nothing was going to match, including the food. But I thought, this is good. This makes you come in to sit down and you think, wow, this is a real place. You know, and it was a real place. We ran 25 years. I stayed 16 years. I just, after a while, I said, please. And I have to say, I still love to cook. And it's still a passion with me. But I really want to write. And so I had gotten off of it and thought that I would never write again, that it would never happen. I had a couple of books. Brenda, I wrote a book on how to feed people in terminal cancer that sold about a little more than 800,000. And that was really nice. And I thought, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the book. But, I just want to write. And so I began to write other things. I'm working on a thing now called, this is a children's book, Uncle Snug and the Box of Dreams. And so it's really nice. It rhymes, we hope, all the way through. And I'm writing about South Berwick, Maine, and what it was like to move there in 1969. I'm probably the first gay hippie to ever walk into the country store. And, what's he wearing? But I have to tell you, I moved into a schoolhouse that was built in 1805, and people had restored it so that I moved in, and it was 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping attic upstairs, a wonderful little kitchen, a fireplace in the living room. It had an outhouse. I could get used to it. I had to. I did. And a path down to the river to go swimming, skinny dipping, and keep yourself. And the rent was $25 a month. And I had a 5-room apartment on East 90th Street for $90 a month. And I thought, well, 25 here and 90 there. That leaves me about $80. I can do that. And so I had no car, and there was nothing to sign up for television. Although in the living room, someone had left an old television set. And I thought, that's interesting. So I turned it on, and it was in French. And I thought, where am I? And so I thought, is this really Maine? And so I switched the channels a little bit. And then all of a sudden, I got this guy on the top of Mount Washington who gives you the weather. And then that smile at the end. I thought, really, where am I? And so it was wonderful to stay there. And I lived there until, it's too long of a story to go into. And the guy who sold me the house that I'm living in now bought it for $2,300 back taxes, sold it to me for $18,000, 4.5 acres overlooking the river and the waterfall. And so I think, better stay here for a while. You're not going to find anything else. And so, anyway, any questions? I'm talking like a fool. Anybody got any questions? Any more?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yeah.
So, when my wife and I first moved here in 1983, were you still there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, we didn't have much money either. We moved here to Dover, 2 kids. But for one wedding anniversary, we said, we're going to go to the Blue Strawberry because we're going to go to this elegant restaurant.
Oh, I hope you weren't disappointed.
Well, not in the food, but I walked in and there's beautiful tablecloths, and then you served the creamer. It was this 1950s cow that you kind of pour the picture on. What kind of restaurant is this?
That's my partner, Gene Brown. And after I left, somebody stopped me on the street and said, oh, I want to tell you, I love that teapot with the blue strawberry on it. I said, I beg your pardon. He said, well, you sold it to me. I said, no, I did not. He said, oh, no, I'm sure it was you. And I said, I'm sure you're wrong. I would never have done that. And that was Gene. He always wanted to make more money, more money, more money. I'd say, you're not going to do it like this, Toots, if you sell a car, And he, unfortunately, he had a wonderful little tiny house, 20 by 20 by 20. He sold it for less money than he should have. He should have held out another year. He could have gotten $350, $400 for it. He sold it for less than $200, and it overlooks the bay, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And to have been able to go and stay there after New York City and spend a weekend there, it was just terrific. So anyway, that's, anybody else with a complaint? Yeah, I hated that cow. I remember that fucking cow. And he did it with a lot of stuff. And I said, just creamer, just, a little pitcher. Yes, ma'am.
Well, speak up again. I'm sure there are other people in this room for whom you have triggered memories.
I hope so.
Well, yeah. I read the book last night, and I have vivid memories of Mary Jane and some of the other people in the book, and I just want to thank you for that.
That's really nice. Thank you. Text me right here. Thank you.